what is the experiment about this war? Who is conducting the experiment? And what are the special interests behind this experiment?
Official US policy, I stress official, and that means NATO goes along, is to fight the war to weaken Russia. What happens to Ukrainians is incidental. Fight the war to weaken Russia. Okay? And in fact, the model that is being used, sometimes quite explicitly, is the model of Afghanistan, where the US, as Zbigniew Brzezinski, it's worth looking at that model. Actually, it's a very detailed study of the end of the war in Afghanistan, which is worth reading, by Diego Cordovez, the UN ambassador who negotiated the peace, and Zelig Harrison, who's one of the leading US experts on the region. Cordovez and Harrison. What they point out is that the war was ended by diplomacy. The Russian army was quite stable, had no problems holding their territory. The US tried to block diplomacy because it wanted to weaken Russia, didn't care what happened to the Afghans. But despite US impediments to the diplomacy, the UN was able to carry out a serious diplomatic process, which did lead to Russian withdrawal. That's Afghanistan. And in fact, the US is proud of having done that. Read Zbigniew Brzezinski, National Security Advisor for Carter. He takes pride in having drawn Russia into an Afghan trap. He convinced President Carter, he says, to send arms to opposition forces that were trying to overthrow the Russian-supported government. And he assumed that that would draw Russia into what he calls an Afghan trap, bring them their Vietnam, as he put it, reflecting the colossal ignorance of Indochina that was the hallmark of US policy for decades. Whatever that meant in his confused mind, he wanted to draw Russia into an Afghan trap. And he was asked years later, do you think it was worth it given what happened to Afghans? He simply ridiculed that. So what does it matter if there's some agitated Muslims, his phrase. Also 1 million cadavers, but don't worry about that. We weakened Russia, okay? Well, that's the model that is being explicitly used now. Let's hamper negotiations, weaken the Russians, and if the Ukrainians suffer, who cares? They don't say those words, but that's what it clearly amounts to. NATO's going along, calling military aid lend-lease, is saying, okay, let's move on to a world war if necessary. Is that what we want? There is total hysteria about this in the United States and Europe. There are a few exceptions, but they're marginalized. In fact, just about every specialist on the topic is marginalized because the government and the media don't like what they're saying. I should say that there's talk now in the great game about isolating Russia. Those who are talking about isolating Russia might have a look at the sanctions map. Take a look at the map of the countries that are imposing sanctions. It's quite revealing. Europe, the English-speaking countries, and Japan, the country that South African apartheid called honorary whites. That's it. The rest of the world is condemning the invasion, deplorable, but saying, what's new? That's what you've been doing to us forever. So yes, it's deplorable, but we're not going to join you. What's happening is the isolation of Europe and the United States. China's not going along. India's not. Indonesia isn't. Countries of Africa aren't. Of Asia. What we're doing in the great game is creating a Russia-China alliance supported by India and other countries of Asia, which will lead to Russia is a declining kleptocracy, but it has enormous resources, mineral, food, other resources. So China will be happy to absorb Russia as a huge supplier of oil, minerals, and so on, which the West will be deprived of, not just oil, lithium, steel, nickel, and so on. Russia has them in abundance. Russia and Ukraine are the major food suppliers of the world. What we are doing by prolonging the war and rejecting negotiations is not only killing lots of Ukrainians, but also imposing massive starvation over much of the world. Millions of people are facing starvation, millions, imminent starvation because of prolongation of the war. Well, more agitated Muslims, who cares about them, to borrow Brzezinski's term.